It was an ordinary afternoon in a small, quiet town. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the streets. The gas station at the edge of town, though not the busiest place, had a few cars lined up, with drivers filling up their tanks or picking up snacks from the convenience store. It was a spot where locals gathered to catch up, talk about their day, or just take a moment of respite. In the midst of the calm, a black woman pulled up to one of the pumps. She was dressed casually but kept to herself, not drawing much attention to her presence. As she got out of her car and opened the gas cap, she didn't notice the officer slowly approaching from behind the store. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern face, had been watching her from the moment she parked. There was something about her that seemed to catch his attention in a way that didn't sit right. She was used to being treated with suspicion by people who didn't know her. It wasn't new, though it still stung. The woman, an FBI agent working undercover in the area for a few weeks, knew how to keep her composure. Her job required her to blend in, to look ordinary even when she wasn't. She had been following a lead related to an ongoing investigation, one that brought her to this quiet corner of the world. But for the moment, her focus was on the task at hand, pumping gas. The officer walked over to her, his boots tapping loudly on the pavement as he approached. He wasn't just casually strolling over, there was a clear purpose in his steps. Without a hint of hesitation, he stopped a few feet away and gave her a once-over. His posture was rigid, and his eyes narrowed as he looked at her, almost as if trying to place her. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" the officer asked, his voice carrying the sort of authority that suggested he was already expecting something to be wrong. His tone wasn't friendly, more like he was making an accusation before anything had even happened. The woman paused, surprised by the abruptness of his approach. She hadn't done anything to draw attention, nor had she broken any laws. But she had seen this sort of thing before, police officers making assumptions based on appearance alone, especially when it came to people who didn't look like they belonged in a certain area. The officer's body language made it clear he was already sizing her up, wondering what her story was. She kept her composure, maintaining the calm, neutral demeanor that came with her training. "No, I'm fine. Just filling up my tank," she replied, her voice steady. She didn't raise her gaze from the pump, not wanting to make things more complicated than they needed to be. She'd dealt with overzealous officers before, and while it wasn't ideal, it wasn't something she hadn't experienced. In her line of work, you learn to handle difficult situations. The officer seemed to take her answer in stride, but there was an edge to his tone as he continued. "You know, it's not very safe to be stopping in places like this. We've got a lot of suspicious activity in this area, especially from people who look out of place." He was vague, but the meaning was clear. She wasn't welcome in his view. Her eyebrows furrowed slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd heard that before, people making assumptions based on appearances. The officer's choice of words wasn't lost on her. "I'm just a woman trying to get some gas," she said, hoping to diffuse the tension with a simple, direct response. "I'm not causing any trouble." The officer took a step closer, clearly not satisfied with her answer. "Where you from?" he asked, his gaze lingering on her as though he expected her to give an explanation for why she might be in a place like this. It wasn't just curiosity, it felt like a challenge, one he had the power to push further if he chose. The woman hesitated for a moment. She could tell this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "Does it matter?" she asked, a little sharper now. It wasn't her usual approach, but something about the way he was sizing her up was starting to irk her. She had dealt with interrogations before, but this one felt different, this one was personal. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, eyeing her as if searching for some sign of dishonesty or guilt. She wasn't sure what he expected to see, but she had no intention of giving him anything to latch onto. The gas pump clicked, signaling that her tank was full. She replaced the nozzle and started to cap her gas tank, but the officer didn't back off. In fact, he seemed to grow more suspicious with each passing second. "You know," he continued, "this area's had a lot of problems lately." It's not uncommon for people like you to come around and try to stir things up. The woman's patience was wearing thin. She had a job to do, and it wasn't to sit around answering questions from a stranger who clearly didn't respect her space. She looked him squarely in the eye and said, "You're assuming a lot. I'm not here to stir things up. I'm just trying to get gas and move on." Her voice was firm now, but she didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. If only he would let her go without further interrogation. But the officer wasn't ready to let her go. There was something about her that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Something that didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, confident yet unassuming. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't fit the mold of who he thought belonged in that part of town. Whatever it was, he wasn't about to let her off easily. "Where's your ID?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. The question hung in the air like an accusation. The woman took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't going to be a simple stop-and-go situation. This officer wasn't just asking questions, he was interrogating her, as if she had something to hide. And in a way, that was exactly what she wanted him to think. But he was about to find out that he was in for a surprise. In this first part, the tension between the officer and the woman has been set up. The officer's suspicion grows as the woman tries to stay calm and carry on with her day, not realizing just how much of an impact this moment will have on both their lives. What started as an ordinary stop at a gas station is quickly becoming something much more complicated. Stay tuned for part 2, where the woman's real identity will be revealed, and the officer's assumptions will be turned upside down. The officer's question hung in the air like a challenge. The woman, still calm, paused for a moment before slowly reaching into her bag, feeling the tension of the situation crawl up her spine. She knew she had to be careful. This wasn't just about a simple interaction anymore. She had already read the officer's body language and knew what he was getting at. He wasn't just questioning her out of curiosity, he was probing for a reason to take action. But there was something else she sensed. Beneath the officer's assertiveness, there was an underlying tone of suspicion, one that had nothing to do with the woman herself and everything to do with his perceptions of who she was and what she was doing there. He wasn't concerned about her being a threat to the community. No, he was concerned about her being out of place. She could feel it, the weight of his assumptions, pushing her to prove she belonged. In a way, she was already one step ahead of him, though he didn't know it yet. With a slow, measured motion, she pulled out her ID. It wasn't the type of ID you'd typically show to prove you were just an ordinary person. No, this one was a little different. The officer couldn't have known that what she was handing him wasn't a simple driver's license from some state's DMV. It was her FBI badge, hidden inside her wallet. She kept it tucked away carefully, knowing she had to keep her cover. But now, in this moment, there wasn't any time to hide. As she held the ID just out of his reach for a second, the officer's eyes flicked down to the card in her hand. For a brief moment, there was a subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty. His hand hovered in the air, unsure whether to take it or step back. The woman had already sensed his hesitation, he was trying to process the situation. His instinct to challenge her had collided with something far more complicated than he was ready for. Without a word, the officer slowly extended his hand to accept the ID. As his fingers brushed the edge of the card, the woman could see the immediate shift in his demeanor. He had been expecting a routine traffic stop or maybe a simple identity check, but what he held in his hands was a piece of information that changed everything. His eyes lingered on the badge for just a second longer than was normal, and the woman could almost feel the wheels turning in his head. He took a step back, his posture now stiff, the earlier confidence fading. "FBI," he muttered under his breath, a mixture of surprise and confusion in his voice. He had clearly not been prepared for this turn of events. His suspicion had been so sharp that he hadn't even considered the possibility that this woman, the one he had so quickly judged as out of place, was actually someone who had every right to be there. Not only did she belong, but she was someone who held a significant role in law enforcement. The woman didn't move, keeping her composure, despite the growing tension. Her heart didn't race, but she could feel the sharpness of the moment. It wasn't every day that she had to reveal her true identity to a stranger on the street, especially not an officer who had already formed an opinion of her. But sometimes, these things couldn't be avoided. She spoke again, her voice measured, but firm. "Yes, I'm an FBI agent. I'm working undercover in the area." Her eyes locked with his as she spoke, making sure he understood the gravity of what she was saying. "I'm not here for trouble. I'm here on official business." The officer stood frozen for a moment, looking at the badge in his hand, then up at her. His face was unreadable, but she could tell that his mind was racing, struggling to catch up with the reality that had just unfolded. A moment ago, he had seen her as just another person to interrogate, another outsider who didn't belong in his town. Now, in an instant, that image had shattered, replaced by the realization that the woman before him wasn't some stranger, she was a professional, someone far beyond the scope of his usual authority. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice now more tentative than before. I didn't realize. I'm sorry." There was an awkward pause, and the woman noticed that his posture had softened, the earlier aggression replaced by uncertainty. She nodded, a simple acknowledgement of his apology, though she wasn't convinced that it was sincere. It wasn't easy for someone like him to admit that they had been wrong, especially when it came to someone like her. But she didn't have the luxury of being offended or upset. She needed to stay focused. Her mission was still ongoing, and the last thing she needed was to waste time dealing with someone's misplaced bias. "It's all right," she said, her tone steady, though there was an edge of authority behind her words. "I understand your job is to be cautious, but I would appreciate it if you would let me finish what I'm doing here." She glanced at the gas pump, then back at him. The gesture wasn't subtle, but it was clear that she had no interest in continuing this conversation any longer than necessary. For a moment, the officer didn't move. He seemed torn, unsure whether to push further or step back. She could almost see the wheels turning in his head, the conflict between his professional duty and his earlier assumptions. After a long pause, he finally nodded and stepped back, almost as if he was relieved to be free of the situation. "Of course," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'll let you get back to it." The woman gave him a polite nod in return, though there was no warmth behind the gesture. Her thoughts were already moving past the encounter. She had already lost valuable time in this small town, and every minute counted. She had work to do. The officer, having realized his mistake, turned and walked away, leaving her alone once again. But the brief interaction had shaken her in ways she hadn't expected. As the officer disappeared into the distance, the woman sighed and returned her focus to her car. The pump had already clicked off, and the tank was full. She closed the gas cap and slid back into her car, her mind still processing the brief exchange. It was moments like these that reminded her of how quickly people could form judgments based on the smallest things like skin color, dress, or the simple fact of looking out of place. In her line of work, she knew better than to let those judgments affect her. But today, for some reason, it had felt different. It was as if the officer's assumptions had been more than just a minor inconvenience, they had been a reminder of the work she was doing, the work that often went unappreciated, even misunderstood. People didn't always know what was happening behind the scenes, and most of the time, they didn't need to. But it could still be exhausting. Starting the car, she put the encounter behind her and drove off, the quiet streets of the town stretching out before her. She had a job to do, and there was no time to dwell on what had just happened. The officer had learned who she was, but that didn't change the fact that she had a mission to complete. And nothing, not even a rude interaction at a gas station, was going to stand in her way. The officer, meanwhile, stood outside the gas station for a moment longer, still processing what had just happened. He had assumed so much, made judgments without thinking, and now, he felt a mix of guilt and frustration. It wasn't often that he had to confront the reality of his biases so directly, and the truth hit harder than he expected. He thought back to the moment when he had first seen her. His first instinct had been to assume she was just another person passing through, someone who didn't belong. But in the end, he was the one who had been out of place, not her. The realization hit him harder than he cared to admit. He walked back to his patrol car and sat down, trying to shake off the awkwardness of the encounter. It was a small moment, really, but it was one that would stick with him for a long time. He hadn't just confronted an FBI agent that day, he had confronted his own assumptions, and that was something he wasn't sure he was prepared for. The officer's initial assumptions about the woman are shattered when he discovers she's an FBI agent. The interaction reveals how deeply ingrained biases can influence perceptions and decisions, even when someone is simply doing their job. As the officer processes his mistake, the woman, focused and professional, moves on with her mission, but the brief encounter leaves an impression on both of them. After the brief exchange with the FBI agent, the officer sat in his patrol car for several minutes, lost in thought. He stared blankly ahead, trying to collect himself, but the images of the woman and her calm, assured demeanor kept resurfacing. The tension in the air, the challenge to his authority, and the sudden shift when he discovered who she really was, it was all playing in his mind like a loop. He hadn't expected it to affect him this much. He had dealt with many encounters like this before, unfriendly, tense, sometimes downright hostile, but this one felt different. The officer had always prided himself on being a no-nonsense type of guy. He was the kind of person who believed in doing things by the book. And yet, here he was, questioning everything he thought he knew. He had assumed that the woman, based on her appearance, didn't belong in this part of town. He had profiled her, something that, deep down, he knew wasn't right. But it had happened anyway. His mind kept replaying the moment when he had seen the FBI badge. His initial shock had quickly turned to embarrassment. She hadn't looked like the type of person he thought would be working in law enforcement. She hadn't fit into the mental image he had built of what an agent would look like, someone more like the officers in the city, perhaps, or someone with a more professional appearance. He had assumed that because she didn't fit that mold, she had to be hiding something. The officer took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He had grown up in a world where people like him, white, middle-aged, a little set in their ways, were the ones in control. The small town he patrolled felt like a microcosm of that worldview. It wasn't that he had consciously thought everyone who didn't look like him was suspicious, but there was an ingrained comfort in the familiar, in seeing people who looked like him, acted like him, and spoke like him. Anyone else? Well, they were other. They had to be watched. Hadn't he been trained to look out for them? That thought stung now. He knew better than this. He should have known better than to make assumptions about a person's character based on the way they looked. But the hard truth was, he had been blinded by his biases. The officer's fingers gripped the steering wheel as he exhaled sharply. He had made a mistake. A big one. And while he could let it slide as an uncomfortable, but temporary misstep, he knew it would stay with him for a long time. The thought that he could have done something worse, made the situation escalate, gotten the agent hurt, made his stomach churn. It wasn't that he had set out to hurt her. But by questioning her unnecessarily, by pushing her into a corner, he had put them both at risk. When he had seen the FBI badge, he had realized the gravity of the situation. She wasn't just anyone, she was someone who had authority. She could have easily reported him, and it wouldn't have taken much to have him removed from his position. The town wasn't the kind of place where someone would typically challenge a local officer's authority, but this was different. This was the FBI. He had no idea what her mission was, or how important it was, but the fact that she was in town on official business was a big deal. The officer knew enough about federal law enforcement to understand that they didn't just send people like her to small towns for nothing. He clenched his jaw, regretting his actions even more. But the thing that troubled him most was the question he kept asking himself: how often had he done this before? How often had he judged people by the way they looked, or by how out of place they seemed? He'd been working in this small town for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never stopped to think about how his assumptions shaped his actions. He had assumed that he was just doing his job, keeping the community safe. But had he been creating problems for people by acting on those assumptions? The officer thought back to the way the woman had responded to him, calmly, without fear or hostility. It was clear that she had been through situations like this before. She hadn't flinched when he questioned her, and she hadn't reacted with anger. She had simply revealed who she was, without making a scene, without feeling the need to explain herself any further. It was a reminder that people who lived in the world of law enforcement, people like her, had to navigate challenges every day that he could never fully understand. He looked out of the patrol car window, watching as people moved in and out of the gas station, unaware of the small moment that had just unfolded. The officer's thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. It was the department. He answered quickly, eager to refocus on something other than his personal reckoning. "Yeah, this is Officer." His voice trailed off as he realized he didn't even feel sure about what to call himself anymore. "Hey, we've got a situation downtown. We need you to head over," the dispatcher said, cutting through his confusion. "Got it," he replied, his voice returning to autopilot. As the call ended, he sat for another moment, his mind slowly shifting back to the present. There was still work to do. There would always be more work, more cases to handle, more issues to resolve. But today, something had shifted. He couldn't put his finger on it exactly, but he knew that the encounter with the FBI agent wouldn't be easily forgotten. As the officer drove toward downtown to respond to the call, the woman, still unaware of the impact her brief interaction had made, continued her mission. She was on her way to a different part of the town now, closer to the area where she had been gathering intel for the past few weeks. Her work was far from over, and despite the unexpected detour at the gas station, she remained focused on her objective. She hadn't been surprised by the officer's suspicion. It was an unfortunate, but not unusual, response. Over the years, she had learned how to read people and situations quickly, and this officer had given her plenty of signals. His body language, his questions, it all spoke volumes. She wasn't naive enough to think that racism didn't exist, and as an undercover agent, she had long since learned how to handle such encounters with grace and control. What she had not expected, however, was the shift she had seen in him once she revealed her badge. The change in his demeanor had been subtle, but it hadn't gone unnoticed. She couldn't be sure if it was because of her being an FBI agent or because he recognized the weight of what he had just done. The officer hadn't been hostile or combative, he had been surprised, uncertain. It had been a humbling moment for both of them, though she didn't think he realized just how much of an effect it had on him. But she wasn't here to play therapist or teach anyone lessons about racism. She was here to do a job, one that required discretion, professionalism, and focus. The small town she was working in had a lot more to reveal, and the officer's assumptions were just one small piece of a much bigger puzzle. Her thoughts turned to the case at hand. There had been whispers of corruption, of illegal dealings going on in the town, small-time criminal activity that had been sweeping under the radar for years. She had been sent here to investigate, to find out who was behind it all, and how far the corruption reached. She couldn't afford to be distracted by an officer's misplaced assumptions, no matter how personal they might have felt. As she drove past the gas station, she couldn't help but wonder if that officer had ever stopped to consider how his actions impacted people. If he had been willing to look beyond appearances, he might have seen something much bigger than what he initially expected. Maybe, just maybe, that was the real lesson in the encounter. The officer begins to reflect on his assumptions and how they've shaped his interactions with others, particularly the FBI agent. The encounter has caused him to question his biases and his place in the community, leading him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Meanwhile, the woman, focused on her investigation, continues with her mission, using the brief interaction as another reminder of the challenges people face when navigating the complexities of societal perceptions and stereotypes. As the officer drove towards downtown to address the call he had received, his mind still drifted back to the unexpected encounter at the gas station. He tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. But it was no use. The image of the FBI agent's composed expression, her quiet confidence, and the way she had presented her badge continued to haunt him. He had made a mistake, and he couldn't simply shake it off. It felt like an unspoken challenge, one that demanded he reassess his own worldview. In the back of his mind, he knew this wasn't just about the woman or her badge, it was about the bigger picture. What had he missed all these years? How many other times had he misjudged people based on the way they looked? How many others had felt uncomfortable, unwelcome, or even unsafe because of his assumptions? The questions continued to swirl in his mind, but he had no time to dwell on them. There was work to do. Meanwhile, the woman in the car, having resumed her journey through the small town, remained undisturbed by the officer's lingering thoughts. She had long ago learned how to compartmentalize such moments, brushing off interactions that were designed to derail her. Her mind was on the task ahead, and nothing, certainly not an uncomfortable stop at a gas station, was going to disrupt her focus. She had been in the field long enough to know that her presence here wasn't just about collecting information, it was about understanding the community, the people, the way things worked under the surface. This wasn't a simple investigation into a few shady characters, it was about uncovering an intricate web of corruption that had its roots deep within the town's framework. And that meant paying attention to every detail, every whisper, every seemingly inconsequential moment. Her job was to expose the truth, no matter where it led. Even if it meant walking through hostile territory or dealing with officers who were more concerned with keeping their territory safe than with uncovering what lay beneath. But today, something had changed. The officer's reaction had stuck with her longer than she expected. She wasn't naive enough to think that people like him could change overnight, but she wondered, just for a moment, if he might begin to see things differently. If she had left him thinking, perhaps it would be a small victory, at least in his own personal growth. But there was no time to dwell on it. She needed to focus. The case was more pressing now than ever. The further she delved into the town, the more she realized that the corruption ran deeper than anyone had suspected. She was starting to connect the dots, pulling together information from witnesses, informants, and even local whispers. What seemed like a small-time operation at first was slowly revealing itself to be part of something much bigger, a network of illegal activities that stretched far beyond the small town limits. The officer, now nearing the downtown area, tried to shake the discomfort off, but his mind kept tugging him back to the moment he had spent with the woman. His radio crackled, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Officer, we've got a situation down here. You need to respond," the dispatcher's voice came through the static. He adjusted the volume and pressed the button to respond. "I'm on my way." The streets downtown were busier now, as expected. The town's main street was lined with small businesses, and the usual late-afternoon hustle had begun to take over. People walked in and out of shops, chatting with neighbors or getting errands done before the evening set in. It was the kind of place where nothing too out of the ordinary ever happened. But that was why he was here. He had a job to do, to ensure that things stayed quiet. He arrived at the scene, a small cafe near the corner of Maple and Main. A couple of cars were parked outside, and a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. The officer's instincts kicked in as he pulled his car to the curb. Something was off. As he stepped out of the vehicle and made his way to the scene, he could hear voices rising in argument. He quickly assessed the situation. A young man, no older than 25, was standing in front of the cafe, shouting at a group of older men who appeared to be regulars in the town. Their heated conversation had drawn a crowd, and from the looks of it, tensions were running high. The officer took a deep breath, focusing on the situation. He had learned over the years how to handle these kinds of disturbances, how to get in and de-escalate before it got out of hand. But today, his mind wasn't entirely in the right place. The image of the woman's badge and her calm confidence was still playing in his mind, and he found it difficult to summon the usual authority in his voice. He walked up to the group, his presence commanding attention. The arguing ceased for a moment as the officer spoke. "What's going on here?" The young man, clearly agitated, didn't seem to recognize the officer. "These guys," he spat, "they're in on it. They're part of the deal. They've been running this scam for years, and no one's doing anything about it." The older men exchanged nervous glances, but didn't respond immediately. The officer, though still unsettled, focused on the young man. "What scam are you talking about?" The young man's face flushed with anger. You're just another one of them, aren't you? You think I'm crazy? I've been trying to get people to listen, but nobody cares. They're all in on it. The mayor, the police, the businesses, they've been hiding the truth from everyone. The officer's eyes narrowed. This was new. He had heard rumors of corruption in the town before, whispers from locals about shady deals, underhanded business practices, and questionable law enforcement behavior, but this was different. This wasn't just a simple complaint. This was an accusation that painted a picture of a conspiracy that ran deep, and it struck him with the force of a punch to the gut. The older men, still silent, looked uneasy. The officer could tell they were trying to avoid getting involved in the confrontation, but he could also see that there was something unspoken in their hesitation. He glanced back at the young man. You need to calm down and explain what you mean. I can't help you if you don't. The young man's face contorted with frustration. You think I'm lying? You think I'm just some crazy kid? I've got proof, man. They've been dealing with the city's contractors, taking kickbacks, and it's all tied in. I've got pictures, documents, it's all right here. He gestured to the backpack slung over his shoulder, pulling it open to reveal a jumble of files and photographs. The officer took a step closer, his curiosity piqued. The young man's claims were wild, but there was something in his tone, something desperate, that made the officer hesitate. He was used to people making accusations, often with little to back them up. But this felt different. The urgency in the young man's voice, the determination, it was real. He glanced back at the older men. They had grown quiet, their eyes avoiding his. That told him everything he needed to know. Something was off. Before he could ask another question, the officer heard the sound of a car pulling up behind him. He turned, and to his surprise, he saw the woman, the FBI agent, stepping out of her vehicle and walking toward the group. She looked composed, collected, and unaffected by the scene around her. The officer's heart skipped a beat. She was here. Had she been following the same leads? Had she been watching the same people? Was this the case she was working on? The tension in the air thickened as the officer's eyes locked with hers. She nodded slightly, as though acknowledging him from across the scene, before turning her attention to the young man. The officer was momentarily stunned. Was she here for this? Had she known this was about to happen? And just like that, the small-town drama had escalated into something far bigger than either of them could have predicted. The officer confronts an unexpected disturbance downtown, leading to an encounter with a young man who accuses local officials and businesses of corruption. His claims appear to tie into the deeper web of wrongdoing that the FBI agent has been investigating. As the officer navigates the growing tension in the town, he unexpectedly finds himself face to face with the agent once again. Both their paths have crossed in the most unlikely of ways, and neither can escape the gravity of what is unfolding. What began as a small-town case now looks like it could be part of something much larger. As the officer stood there, his eyes locked on the FBI agent who had just arrived on the scene, a wave of realization washed over him. The young man's accusations, which had seemed wild moments ago, suddenly felt more tangible with her presence. He could sense the shift in the air, an invisible thread connecting their separate investigations, weaving them into something much bigger than either had anticipated. The agent didn't even glance in his direction as she approached the group. She was all business. Her gaze moved between the young man and the older men, analyzing the situation with the sharpness of someone who had dealt with this kind of chaos many times before. Without missing a beat, she spoke in a calm, even tone. "Mind if I take a look at those documents?" she asked, addressing the young man, who was still clutching his backpack with a mix of hope and desperation. The officer stood back, watching intently. He couldn't deny the pull of curiosity that tugged at him. He had spent his career working within the confines of his town, convinced that he knew everyone's secrets, convinced that there was little room for surprise. But the events of the last few hours, his encounter with the FBI agent, the young man's accusations, the sense of something larger unfolding, had shattered that illusion. This was no longer just a routine disturbance. There was something serious at play, and the agent's sudden involvement only confirmed it. The young man hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between the officer and the woman before him. But then, as if he recognized the authority in her presence, he reluctantly pulled out a stack of photographs and a few folded documents, handing them to the agent. "Here," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "I've been trying to get someone to take this seriously for months. But no one listens. They just keep sweeping it under the rug. These guys, they're in on it. All of them." The agent took the papers with a nod, her fingers brushing over the worn edges of the photographs. She didn't flinch at the content, her expression unreadable. The officer couldn't help but watch closely, his instincts telling him that what she was seeing was far more important than he could yet understand. As she glanced through the photos and documents, the young man continued, his voice growing more impassioned. "They're making deals with the construction companies. The mayor's office is involved, the police, some of the local businesses, they've been getting kickbacks for years. I've got proof. Look at this." He grabbed a photo from the pile and pointed to it. "This is the mayor, shaking hands with the contractors. This one's of the police chief with them, too. And these are from inside the town hall meetings. I've been trying to get someone to investigate it, but everyone's too scared." The officer's pulse quickened as he took in the photo the young man had shown the agent. He recognized the faces, the mayor, the police chief, a few business owners he had known for years. It was a stark contrast to the image of the town he had always held in his mind, one built on community and trust. The web of corruption the young man was describing, if true, cut to the very core of everything the officer had worked to protect. The agent was quiet for a moment as she absorbed the evidence, flipping through the rest of the photographs. Her calmness seemed to heighten the tension in the air, as though she was preparing herself for what was to come. She looked up at the officer, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke. "This is serious," she said, her voice steady but low. "It seems like everything the young man is saying checks out, and this goes deeper than we initially thought. We need to move quickly." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the weight of the situation left him momentarily speechless. He had been dealing with small-town politics his entire life, but this was different. The implications of the young man's claims were vast, and it suddenly became clear that the officer was not equipped to handle this on his own. The small-town world he had always known was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by a murky world of corruption, crime, and betrayal. "Officer," the agent said, her gaze snapping back to him, "we're going to need your help, whether you're ready for it or not. You've been here longer than anyone. You know the people, you understand the power dynamics. But from here on out, you're going to need to trust me, and you're going to need to be careful." Her words cut through his confusion. She wasn't just asking for his help, she was demanding it. She knew what she was dealing with, and he could sense the authority in her voice. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough to realize that this wasn't just a matter of cleaning up petty corruption. This was a massive, well-established network that was threatening the fabric of the town itself. If they didn't act, things could spiral out of control. The officer nodded, the gravity of the moment settling on his shoulders like a heavy weight. "I don't know how deep this goes," he said slowly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I'll do what I can." The young man continued, his voice growing more impassioned. "They're making deals with the construction companies. The mayor's office is involved, the police, some of the local businesses, they've been getting kickbacks for years. I've got proof. Look at this." He grabbed a photo from the pile and pointed to it. "This is the mayor, shaking hands with the contractors. This one's of the police chief with them, too. And these are from inside the town hall meetings. I've been trying to get someone to investigate it, but everyone's too scared." The officer's pulse quickened as he took in the photo the young man had shown the agent. He recognized the faces, the mayor, the police chief, a few business owners he had known for years. It was a stark contrast to the image of the town he had always held in his mind, one built on community and trust. The web of corruption the young man was describing, if true, cut to the very core of everything the officer had worked to protect. The agent was quiet for a moment as she absorbed the evidence, flipping through the rest of the photographs. Her calmness seemed to heighten the tension in the air, as though she was preparing herself for what was to come. She looked up at the officer, her expression unreadable, before she finally spoke. "This is serious," she said, her voice steady but low. "It seems like everything the young man is saying checks out, and this goes deeper than we initially thought. We need to move quickly." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but the weight of the situation left him momentarily speechless. He had been dealing with small-town politics his entire life, but this was different. The implications of the young man's claims were vast, and it suddenly became clear that the officer was not equipped to handle this on his own. The small-town world he had always known was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by a murky world of corruption, crime, and betrayal. "Officer," the agent said, her gaze snapping back to him, "we're going to need your help, whether you're ready for it or not. You've been here longer than anyone. You know the people, you understand the power dynamics. But from here on out, you're going to need to trust me, and you're going to need to be careful." Her words cut through his confusion. She wasn't just asking for his help, she was demanding it. She knew what she was dealing with, and he could sense the authority in her voice. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough to realize that this wasn't just a matter of cleaning up petty corruption. This was a massive, well-established network that was threatening the fabric of the town itself. If they didn't act, things could spiral out of control. The officer nodded, the gravity of the moment settling on his shoulders like a heavy weight. "I don't know how deep this goes," he said slowly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I'll do what I can." The young man, who had been anxiously watching the exchange, let out a breath of relief. "You're not going to just sweep it under the rug, right? You'll do something about this?" The agent gave the young man a reassuring nod. "We're going to look into it, and we're going to bring it to light. You've done the right thing." As she spoke, the officer found himself looking at the young man with a new understanding. The boy's anger and frustration had been raw, but there had been truth in his words. It was clear that he had been trying to expose something for months, all while being dismissed, ignored, and even silenced. Now, for the first time, he had found someone willing to listen. And that person wasn't just the local law enforcement, he was standing right next to an FBI agent, someone who could actually do something. The agent turned back to the officer, her expression serious. "I need you to keep this quiet for now. No one can know we're looking into this, not until we have all the evidence we need. If we start making moves too soon, we'll alert the people behind this, and they'll cover their tracks. Do you understand?" The officer hesitated for a moment. It wasn't like he had much of a choice. But the idea of keeping quiet about something this big, something that threatened the entire town, felt wrong. Still, he knew the FBI agent was right. If they acted recklessly, they could ruin their chances of getting the truth out. "Yeah," he finally replied, his voice low. "I get it." The agent turned to leave, but not before giving the young man one last look. "Stay in touch. We'll need you if we're going to move forward with this." The young man nodded enthusiastically. "I won't let you down. I've got more pictures, more info. I'll keep digging." As the agent and the officer began to walk toward their vehicles, the weight of the moment settled in. The officer had thought his role in this town was clear-cut. He had believed in the small-town myth, the idea that everyone knew everyone, that nothing serious ever happened here. But that myth had been shattered in a matter of hours. He was no longer just the local law enforcement officer, he was part of something much bigger, something dangerous, something that could shake the foundations of the town he had sworn to protect. As the officer slid into his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a threshold. He had gone from being a mere bystander in his own town to an active participant in an investigation that could expose the darkest parts of its underbelly. And as much as he tried to focus on the task at hand, he knew that the truth was about to come crashing down, on him, on the town, and on everyone who had turned a blind eye to what had been happening right under their noses. But it was too late to turn back now. The officer and the FBI agent's paths collide as they confront the young man's explosive allegations of corruption and kickbacks involving the local government and law enforcement. The officer, initially uncertain about the depth of the situation, begins to grasp the magnitude of the case at hand. As they work together, the agent demands secrecy and cooperation, leading both to realize that the case they are about to unravel goes far deeper than anyone could have imagined. The officer is no longer just a small-town cop, he is now part of a larger investigation, and the truth is beginning to come to light. The days that followed were a blur for the officer. After the encounter at the cafe with the FBI agent and the young man, everything had shifted. The small-town life he had known for so long seemed to unravel with each passing hour. What had started as an innocent, routine day had now spiraled into something much darker, something that had the power to destroy the fabric of the community. The officer knew he couldn't go back to his old ways of just turning a blind eye or pretending that things were fine. The corruption that the young man had exposed was real, and it was everywhere, deep within the heart of the town, concealed beneath the layers of small-town charm and complacency. The agent had made it clear, they needed to proceed with caution, and they needed to gather more evidence before anyone caught wind of what was really going on. The officer had never thought of himself as someone who would get involved in something this dangerous. He had spent his entire career dealing with petty crimes, traffic stops, and the occasional domestic dispute. He had always thought of himself as someone who upheld the law, someone who served and protected. But now, he was faced with a much more complex reality. The lines between right and wrong were blurring, and he wasn't sure where he stood anymore. Over the next few days, the officer and the FBI agent worked in secrecy, moving like shadows through the town, careful not to draw attention to their investigation. The officer did his best to maintain a normal routine, but his interactions with people felt strained. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him, that someone might be aware of what was happening behind closed doors. He had been in this town long enough to know when something was off. And lately, it felt like the air had thickened with suspicion. People were looking at him differently. He caught whispers in the streets, the side glances from his fellow officers, the tight smiles from business owners who had known him for years. It was as though everyone had some unspoken understanding, except for him. He was the outsider now, trying to piece together a puzzle that nobody wanted him to solve. The FBI agent had given him a few leads to follow, but every step felt like treading on thin ice. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. The officer knew that if word got out about their investigation, the consequences would be severe, not just for him, but for everyone involved. There were powerful people at play, and those people didn't take kindly to being exposed. One evening, the officer received an unexpected phone call. It was from the FBI agent, and her voice was urgent. "We need to meet. Now." His stomach churned at the tone of her voice. He had grown accustomed to her calm, controlled demeanor, and hearing her sound this concerned only heightened his anxiety. Without a second thought, he grabbed his jacket and headed out to the agreed-upon location, a small, dimly lit diner on the edge of town. It was a place no one would think to look for them, tucked away behind thick hedges and far from the watchful eyes of the town's residents. When he arrived, the agent was already sitting in a booth, her back to the wall. She looked up as he walked in, her expression as serious as ever. She gestured for him to sit. "Any problems?" she asked, her voice low. The officer shook his head, settling into the booth. "No, everything's quiet." "What's going on?" The agent slid a folder across the table. "This just came in. We've got confirmation. The mayor, the police chief, and at least 3 local businessmen are involved in a large-scale bribery scheme. They've been taking kickbacks from construction companies in exchange for lucrative town contracts. But it goes deeper than that. They've been laundering money through the local businesses, restaurants, shops, even some of the real estate deals. It's a network, and it's been going on for years." The officer's eyes widened as he processed the information. He had known something was off, But hearing it laid out in front of him, so clearly and definitively, sent a shock through his system. The people he had worked with every day, the ones he had trusted for years, were all part of a scheme that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The small-town facade he had relied on, the one that told him everything was fine, was nothing but a lie. "They're all involved?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The agent nodded grimly. "It's not just a few bad apples. This is systemic. And it's bigger than we thought. We're dealing with a network that spans beyond the town. The mayor's ties go all the way to the state level. They've been using their positions to funnel money into larger accounts, money that's been used to fund political campaigns, pay off law enforcement, and protect their operations." The officer swallowed hard. His world felt like it was spinning out of control. The thought that he had been unknowingly walking among criminals for all these years, even working alongside them, was almost too much to bear. He had always prided himself on his integrity, on doing the right thing. But now, faced with the reality of the situation, he wondered if he had ever truly understood what was going on in his own town. The agent continued, "We need your help to gather more evidence. We're going to need to take down the whole operation, not just a few individuals. And that means going after the ones who are untouchable. The mayor, the police chief, they're the ones who pull the strings. But to get to them, we need to expose the people beneath them first. You've got connections, you know the town. We need you to start talking to people, see if anyone's willing to cooperate." The officer's heart sank. He knew what this meant. It wasn't just about gathering information now, it was about making hard choices. The people he would have to go after were the ones who had built this town with him. He had grown up here, worked with these men and women for years. How could he possibly betray them? "I don't know if I can do this," he said quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. The agent leaned forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "You don't have a choice. If we don't stop this, it will destroy everything. Your career, your town, your future, all of it. It's not just about you anymore. There are innocent people being affected by this, people who don't even know what's going on behind the scenes. And if we don't take action, we're complicit in it too." Her words stung, and they hit home. The officer knew she was right. He had already been complicit by standing by not questioning the system he had worked in for so long. He had turned a blind eye to the whispers, to the rumors that had floated around for years. But now, with the evidence in front of him, he could no longer ignore the truth. "I'll do what I can," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'll start talking to people. But this is going to get ugly." The agent nodded. "We're ready for that. But we need to move fast. The longer this goes on, the more dangerous it becomes." For the officer, there was no turning back now. As the days passed, he began to question everyone he had known, everyone he had trusted. He started reaching out to people who might be willing to talk, but it wasn't easy. Fear gripped the town like a vice. People were too scared to speak out, too terrified of the repercussions if they did. Whispers of retaliation, lost jobs, ruined reputations, or worse, kept many silent. But there were cracks in the armor. A few individuals, people who had been watching from the sidelines, started to come forward. They had seen enough, suffered enough, and now, they were ready to speak. Slowly but surely, the officer began to gather the pieces of the puzzle. One evening, as the officer sat in his patrol car, reviewing notes, the phone rang again. It was the FBI agent. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice as calm as ever. He exhaled slowly. "I think so. It's time." The real work was about to begin. The officer finds himself drawn deeper into the investigation, uncovering the full scale of the corruption that has taken root in his town. As the agent reveals more about the powerful figures behind the scheme, the officer faces a painful dilemma, whether to protect the town he's known for so long or take a stand against the people who have been running it into the ground. With the pressure mounting, he begins to understand the gravity of the situation and the difficult choices he must make. The investigation is about to enter its most dangerous phase, and there's no turning back. The officer sat in his patrol car long after his shift had ended, staring at the darkened streets of the town he had once thought he knew so well. The familiar townscape now seemed alien to him. The crisp, quiet night air, which he had once enjoyed for its peace, now felt suffocating. Every car that passed, every person who walked by, seemed like a potential threat. He couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in on him. The weight of what he was involved in was settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, and he was struggling to breathe under its burden. He glanced down at the stack of papers on the passenger seat. The evidence was overwhelming: photographs, documents, transcripts of conversations, and accounts from several people who had been willing to talk. Some were scared, others were angry. All of them were connected by one common thread: the corrupt network that had its grip on the town. The mayor, the police chief, business owners, and several key players in local government had been running a well-oiled machine of kickbacks, bribery, and money laundering for years. Now, all of it was laid bare before him, and he was the one who had to decide what to do with it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The FBI agent. He answered quickly, trying to steady his voice. "Yeah? Meet me at the diner." "Now," she said, her tone sharp and urgent. The officer didn't ask questions. He started the car and drove in the direction of the diner. As he pulled into the parking lot, he saw the familiar figure of the agent standing by the door, her back to the night, her eyes scanning the streets as if she were waiting for something, or someone. When he approached, she didn't greet him with her usual calm demeanor. Instead, her face was tight with tension, and she motioned for him to follow her inside. The usual waitress wasn't at the counter tonight. The place was eerily quiet, as though it too was holding its breath. The agent took a seat in one of the back booths, not bothering with the menu. She was all business. The officer slid into the booth across from her, his gaze flickering to the coffee cups on the table. His hands were shaking slightly, betraying the calm he tried to project. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice low. "I can feel it. The town's on edge. People are starting to talk, and I'm not sure who I can trust anymore." The agent didn't immediately respond, her gaze fixed on something outside the window. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with frustration. "You're right to be worried. We've been working in the dark for too long. We've gotten close, but not close enough. The higher-ups are getting suspicious. The mayor's office is catching wind of the investigation, and they're starting to tighten their grip." The officer felt his stomach twist. He had known things were getting tense, but hearing it from her, seeing the concern in her usually stoic face, made it real. "What does that mean for us?" "For me? We've got a deadline. We need to move quickly, or we risk exposing the investigation. The mayor's people are starting to circle, and we've got leaks. They know something's up. They're probably watching you, watching us." A chill ran down the officer's spine. He had suspected it for days, the way people had been looking at him, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. It was as if his every move was being scrutinized. But hearing the agent confirm it made the reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to clear the fog in his mind. "What do we do now?" The agent leaned in, her voice lowering even further. "We need to go public. If we can't stop the corruption from the inside, we'll expose it from the outside. We've gathered enough evidence to take down the key players, the mayor, the police chief, a few of the businessmen, but we need to move before they shut us down." The officer's heart skipped a beat. "You want to go to the press?" He had always been a law and order guy, the one who believed in discretion, in handling things quietly. The idea of publicly outing the corruption, of potentially tearing apart everything he had worked for, seemed like a reckless gamble. The agent nodded, her gaze unflinching. "Yes. But it won't be easy. Once we go public, there's no turning back. The town will be in chaos. People will be angry, scared, and there's no telling how far the fallout will spread. But it's the only way to make sure the truth comes to light. The officer's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. If they exposed the truth, everything would change, his career, his relationships, his life. But if they didn't, the corruption would continue, and more people would suffer. The risk, the fallout, the officer trailed off, unable to fully articulate the storm of thoughts that was swirling in his head. "I know," the agent said quietly. "But if we don't act now, we lose everything. And we've already lost too much." The officer looked down at his hands, his fingers curled into fists. There was no easy answer here. There were no simple solutions. If he sided with the agent, he would be exposing not only the criminals in his town, but his own role in it. He had been complicit in allowing this system to persist, in ignoring the signs, in failing to ask questions. His own moral compass had failed him when he turned a blind eye. But the longer he thought about it, the clearer it became. He couldn't keep pretending. Not when the truth was so undeniable. Not when innocent people were caught in the crossfire. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of the town. He straightened up, meeting the agent's eyes. "All right. Let's do it. But we need to make sure we're ready. We need everything we've got. Every bit of evidence, every witness, every detail." The agent's eyes flickered with approval. "We're ready. I've been prepping the press release, and I've got a meeting with a few key reporters. We'll release everything at once, make sure it hits hard." The officer felt a knot form in his stomach. The weight of the decision still lingered, but there was a strange clarity in his mind now. If this town was going to survive, it would only do so if the truth came out. And he had to be part of that. He couldn't keep hiding from it. The agent stood up, and the officer followed suit. As they walked toward the door, he turned to her one last time. "This is going to change everything." The agent nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "We're already too deep to back out now. Let's make sure the truth finally sees the light of day." The officer's mind raced as he drove back home that night. His car felt empty without the agent beside him, without the weight of her unwavering confidence in the air. But now, he had a different kind of burden. He had crossed the point of no return. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to break when he pulled into his driveway. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe, just for a moment. The clock was ticking, and things were about to change. He couldn't say for sure what would happen when the truth finally came out. Would people turn on him? Would they see him as a hero, or as a traitor? Would they forgive him for being blind to the corruption around him for so long? But as he stepped inside his house, the officer knew one thing for sure: it was time to stop pretending. The truth was coming. And there was no way to stop it. The officer faces the tipping point of the investigation, with the FBI agent pushing for a public reveal of the corruption network that has infiltrated the town. The decision to go public carries enormous risks, including the potential fallout for the officer's career and personal life. As the weight of the situation becomes unbearable, the officer finds his resolve, knowing that the truth must come out, no matter the cost. The investigation has reached its final stages, and the officer is now ready to face the consequences of exposing the deep-rooted corruption.